Joe Burrow's done something, according to PFF, that only one other guy has done since 2021. Let's get into that impressive PFF statistic.
You are Locked On Bengals, your daily Cincinnati Bengals podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, Bengals fans, and welcome to another episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. I'm your host, Jake Lisco, along with your host, James Rapine. Today, we're joined by Brad Spielberger from Pro Football Focus to discuss a few things. One, Brad wrote up some off-season grades. He was very fond of what the Bengals did. We'll get to that in a little bit, in addition to looking at some extensions, some possible extensions for some Cincinnati Bengals. We've been talking about that a little bit lately as well. But we're going to start, Brad, with these grade numbers. This was a big conversation topic on Twitter yesterday. Before we get there, if you're new to the show, you can subscribe on YouTube. You can subscribe anywhere you get your podcast. You can become an everydayer. Make sure you don't miss an episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast as we go through some guests in the offseason. And you can join that first listen club. We appreciate all of you who make us your first listen every day. And Brad, let's talk about it. You tweeted on June 19th, a tweet that has sparked conversation across the internet. Chiefs fans, Bills fans, Bengals fans, probably to and on, if I had to guess. Games with a 90-plus PFF grade since 2021. Josh Allen has 9. Joe Burrow has 6. No other quarterback has 3. And it kind of goes in line with Joe Burrow's overall grade, which has led PFF over the last 2 years. But then there are all these other stats out there and all these other critics out there that would say this and that about Joe Burrow. And I don't think anyone's ranking Joe Burrow number 1 on their top quarterback rankings, as much as that's valuable or invaluable or not valuable quarterback rankings at this time of year. But what does that say about how good Joe Burrow has been in the last 2 years?
Yeah, I think our head of communications, Dave Safaro, thought, Bengals fans and Chiefs fans don't argue enough about Joe Burrow and Patrick Mahomes on Twitter. So let's just kind of ramp that up a bit because you just never see it. So I'm glad he kind of, had that foresight to get it out there. Now, all jokes aside, I do think Burrow is a guy that maybe you want to see more week-to-week consistency with maybe limiting the negatives as opposed to making the big plays. But we've talked a lot, of course, about taking some sacks and letting pressure convert into sacks. Does some of that fall onto Joe Burrow? I think obviously last year we kind of, I think, can write off the Steelers game as more of just, appendix surgery, missing some offseason, and then just frankly was not ready for the first game. But yeah, look, I think he's a top 3 quarterback in the NFL. I think it's the 2 guys you just mentioned, and of course Patrick Mahomes. I guess I'm not ready to put him at number 1 yet either. He obviously himself has said that too, which I think is fair. But he's definitely, if he's not in your top 5, in my opinion, I'm not sure you know exactly what you're watching.
What steps does he need to take to potentially get to that? Let's say he's 5th on some of our listeners' rankings. Probably not many since this is Locked On Bengals, but let's say he's 5th. What does he have to do to get to that next tier? Or say you said you have him in the top 3. How does he cement himself ahead of Josh Allen or try to catch up with Patrick Mahomes?
Yeah, I do think there need to be some games where, like, you do see a little bit less of the heroics and more of just the consistent. Not that he's always that type of player, the boomer bust type guy. He will take the easy throw. He will check down here and there, maybe more consistently, or attack the intermediate parts of the field more consistently, and have that be more of a focal point. To the degree where people can't argue, oh, well, he can throw it up to Jamar Chase or throw it up to Tee Higgins and they can make plays. Obviously, you still want that in your offense, but just maybe attacking every part of the field. But again, it's honestly grasping at straws and nitpicking his game. I think cerebrally, he's at as high of a level as you can be, and that'll only get better with more experience, seeing more defenses, seeing more things against him. I mean, the division might be the best division in football this year. It's certainly in the conversation. So if you're doing it against the AFC North and the rest of your schedule, which probably will be, a bit of a nightmare no matter what in this conference. I think it's going to be hard to argue against him. But yeah, it's very small stuff. I think the biggest thing, honestly, is just staying upright and staying clean and just limiting some of those sacks and some of those negative plays.
Yeah, and you talk about consistency. You just look at his season last year, his first half of the season versus the second half of the season plus the playoffs. And there is, in my opinion, what looks like a pretty big divide where, he doesn't have a PFF grade under 70 for that second half of the season. And for the most part, he's much, much higher than that. The sack avoidance numbers completely changed about halfway through the season. And, the pressure to sack ratio goes from, high 20% to low 20%, high teens for the rest of the season. And it looks like he just decides, I'm not going to take sacks anymore. I'm going to become more consistent with checking the ball down on time. And if you watch him, which we obviously did very closely, the amount of times where Joe Burrow is getting the ball off on time is incredible, like really, really high level stuff. And so I'd like to see that continue as well. And like you mentioned, the one part of the field where it seems like this offense could be a little bit more productive, and it's hard to say whether that's Joe Burrow or whether that's a product of having Jamar Chase and Tee Higgins and the style of offense, is over the middle of the field and the intermediate part of the field. It seems like a lot of the quarterback evaluators out there love the backside dig because it's such a difficult throw from a processing perspective. It requires arm strength, all these things. They love the elastic arm kind of throws. Those aren't as much a part of Burrow's game. And I wonder if they're knocking him because he doesn't do some of the things that their favorite quarterbacks do from an aesthetic perspective or a stylistic perspective. And if he added those to his game, then, maybe that's another step. But it seems like, to me, he figures things out as he goes. He doesn't get beat by the same things more than once. The Ravens defense, for example, will be a fun challenge this year to see how he adapts after they gave him a tough time last year. But I think we've seen him take a lot of those steps.
No, I totally agree. I mean, the biggest stat I think you could look at is they've always shown up well in EPA per dropback, looking at just the production. But if you broke it down to success rate, his first couple of years, they were in the 20s, right? And that's just simply, on every single snap, are they having a successful play or not? And if it's 1st and 10 and you go incomplete 20 yards, obviously you don't really care. But it'd be good to see 7 yards, 8 yards, 10, so just you're consistently moving the ball, and that dramatically changed. They were top 5, I want to say, in success rate from, I think it was week 8 through the end of the season last year. So just like you said, it was not only the explosives, but also the consistency. And yeah, the structure around him, both play calling and offensive line and all those things, is a factor as well. It's not all on him. But yeah, I agree with you. I think you see him learn. That's the biggest thing you can do at quarterback, frankly, is you're going to make mistakes. The Ravens are going to throw stuff at you that you've probably never seen. But just know the next time you see it, okay, this is what they did last time. Maybe I know where I'm going pre-snap. I don't have to think too much, things like that.
Exciting to see his mental development and how that continues. It's always been something that, to me, has been pretty impressive in his NFL career. Coming up next, Brad, we can get away from the tweet. We'll let you breathe. We'll take some attention off the tweet. We'll talk about, you really like the Bengals offseason. And I remember last year we were talking about offensive tackle contracts that were signed. And this year you really like the one that the Bengals signed. We'll dive into your offseason evaluation for the Cincinnati Bengals coming up next.
Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. Baseball season is in full swing, and there's no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel. FanDuel is America's #1 sports book, and right now new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's $1,000 in bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. All you have to do is go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel.com/lockedon. And look, the Reds, well, they've been really, really interesting over the past couple of weeks, from Matt McClain to Ellie De La Cruz. So maybe you want to wager on them. Maybe you want to get in on action all across Major League Baseball, or look ahead to future NFL bets. You can do all of those things and so much more right now at FanDuel. So don't miss your chance to snag a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 when you join FanDuel today. FanDuel.com/lockedon. Again, FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. Brad, let's dive into your offseason grades a bit. And the Bengals, one of a few A's that you handed out. And one of the the most surprising signings in franchise history, maybe the most surprising, leads the way with the Orlando Brown Jr. deal. Just full disclaimer, we did our entire free agency show that day at like 10 at night, and the signing comes down at like 10:30. So I don't think anyone here saw it coming. And the contract part of it that Jake mentioned, I think, is a big reason why. I think everyone expected him to get more, that the Bengals wouldn't swim in those waters. And instead they get him for 4 years, $64 million. I assume that's a huge part of why you gave them an A for their offseason.
Yeah, it's by far the biggest variable there. I mean, to address a need with a multi-year contract, I'd value that. Look, he's not Laremy Tunsil, but you're basically making $10 million less per year now than the highest paid left tackle. The cash flows are all consistent. Yes, he got the big roster bonus or signing bonus, whatever he kind of put out as the rationale for why he liked the deal. It's 50 years over 3 and 64 over 4. Like, it's a pretty standard, pretty flat rate deal. And yeah, I mean, you just solidify a position for the next couple of years. I think he's an above average to good player that should be making more than that on the open market. I get the narrative, and should he be a right tackle, and is he elite? Maybe he thinks he is, but he's not quite elite. He's a very good left tackle, right? Those guys are not really available all that often. So that was the biggest one. But I also think, not chasing, you knew you were going to lose some talented players. Both starting safeties, you'd probably love to have back, but you knew you weren't going to be able to bring them back unless you're going to spend a lot of money. I like how they navigated that situation. I was kind of surprised Jermaine Pratt came back, but at that price point, I understand it. So I think they were just patient. They didn't really chase anything. They let it come to them. And Orlando Brown, I think, signifies that better than anything else. But it just tended to work in most decisions they made.
And that's been their approach, it seems, for the last few years. They've let things come to them a little bit. They've got some same old Bengals in them in some ways, in terms of the way they do business, in terms of the contract structure, in terms of kind of having a price point in mind and not moving off of it significantly, at least from what we've heard about contracts they've offered and kind of the way we've seen some contract situations play out. There's a couple things that we can talk about there. One of them is Orlando Brown, and we can talk about linebackers as well, because Jermaine Pratt was a surprise to, I think, most, if not all, that cover the Bengals or were looking at free agency and kind of trying to predict where people would go. But that partially predicated, I think, by Von Bell's departure, which was also somewhat surprising, given that it was very easy to predict that Jesse Bates was going to go. But Orlando Brown, on his third team, on his second contract, relatively rare to see a player like that be near the top of his free agency class. A lot of times when you see players bounce around like this, people start to wonder, well, there must be a reason. And obviously we know in Baltimore, it was because he didn't want to play right tackle. He turned down a huge deal from Kansas City that, a couple of years ago, maybe he wishes he would have taken from a financial perspective. But how big of a difference is it for Orlando Brown that he's blocking now for the style of quarterback that is Joe Burrow versus the style of quarterback that is Lamar Jackson and Patrick Mahomes, from a play extension perspective, from a time to throw perspective? Is that something that might amplify or work well with his game?
I do think so. Yeah, I think when you look at true pass sets, which, not to go fully into the weeds, but is basically, between 2.5 and 4 seconds. So you don't get those super extended plays. You also, remove screen passes and stuff like that just aren't really indicative. He shows up a little bit better, in his pass protection metrics than when you look at the full scope of things. And yeah, we talk about it. Burrow has brought his average time to throw down. He still, of course, is going to extend plays and make things happen downfield when he needs to. But I think this structure does suit Orlando Brown pretty well. If I had to pick between the three quarterbacks, that he's now played in front of, I would imagine his game meshes the best with a Burrow. Just kind of a more rhythm and timing offense that is trending more and more in that direction as time goes on.
Are any of the other offseason moves, or of the other offseason moves, what stood out the most? Is it the Jermaine Pratt re-signing? Is it some of their under the radar moves? What else stands out besides Orlando Brown?
Yeah, I think the big thing that they've been able to do, if you look at both the free agency and the draft, is that, not only do they have talent at starting spots, like I also like bringing in a Nick Scott. I think he's a versatile, good player. Obviously, he is not right now in the caliber of a Jesse Bates or a Von Bell, but I think he's going to be a good player and a good value on his deal. But then the ability to, because the way you've drafted and signed the last couple of years, like I love the Myles Murphy pick. I love the Jordan Battle pick. and neither guy needs to start right away necessarily, right? Like you're bringing guys in that are talented, good football players that could maybe have large roles right away, but because you've been strong in your approach and again, haven't chased some big deals, it's enabled you now to have quality depth at pretty much every position on the roster, which again, like getting good starters is the first part of the battle. We all know that, but then also having good players behind them is really that next step you have to take if you want to make it through, a 17-game schedule and the playoffs and all these things. And I think they're better positioned in that regard than they've been as far as I can remember, frankly.
And we've seen depth come up and bite them for the last couple of years in their playoff runs, mostly on the offensive line. And they have more offensive linemen under contract at this point, going through their offseason, competing for roster spots than they have in the last few years. Before we talk about some of the contracts, and Jermaine Pratt will come back up, I think, here when we talk about Logan Wilson eventually. Anything that you would like to see the Bengals do in the remainder of the offseason that might get this from, a solid 95A or 94A or whatever your grading scale is, bumped up closer to that A+ range?
Yeah, so I do think at this point it seems like Jonah Williams recognizes he should just get ready to play right tackle, settle in, play there at Alabama, has the experience, and frankly, the market's like it's not really a strong argument anymore. Back in the day, I would have no issue whatsoever with the tackle being like, I refuse to move. And obviously, it's kind of ironic that Orlando Brown is here for the same reason. But the markets are basically the same. Like you got Lane Johnson at around $20.5 million, and I mentioned Laremy Tunsil at 25. So anyway, let's say Jonah's there. He's fine with it. He's comfortable. I think I'd rather start him than a Lyle Collins that I'm not sure when he'll be fully healthy. Seems like he's ahead of schedule, but the injury I read about him sounded pretty gnarly. And obviously he has a bit of an extended history there. So long answer short, maybe even still looking at a George Fant or like one more kind of swing piece, a guy that you could bring in for 1 year, $2.5 million. I know we talk about offensive line probably too much, but just really like nail that down so you have no concern if injuries pile up or if guys are unhappy or anything like that.
Are you surprised they didn't do anything with Mixon's contract? That was something we talked about a ton here, and I guess they still could. But are you surprised that he's still at that number currently?
I am very surprised, especially because you could just point to now if you're them, say, look, Dalvin got cut, Zeke got cut, Aaron Jones took a pay cut. Like all the franchise, like you're not even just saying it for yourself or just making an argument. Oh, we need the help. It's like, no, like everyone's doing it. We're also going to do it. Not even getting into the legal stuff and everything else going on there. So yeah, I am kind of surprised that he is still, look, maybe they lost leverage because they did not, they don't have an Alexander Madison or a Tony Pollard in place, right? You do add Chase Brown in the 5th round. You have some guys there, but, you lose Samaje Perine. Like you do maybe just say, hey, you know what? We can't play hardball because he might say, all right, well, then I'm out. And then we kind of feel like we are deficient at that position.
Let's continue with some potential contract extensions from another Joe to Tee Higgins and more. We'll do that with Brad coming up next.
Let's talk extensions. We've been talking about this. We've talked about the Peyton Manning and his receivers in Indianapolis where that's happened before. And we've talked with Brad about this before too. It looks like the Bengals are waiting to get the Joe Burrow deal done before they make any other extension moves this year. There's been a lot of speculation about what a team-friendly deal might look like for Joe Burrow with his comments about having awareness of the other guys on this team that he would like to have playing with him on the Bengals as long as possible. But we still expect that Joe Burrow's contract will set the market at quarterback in one way or another. So nobody's under the illusion that Joe Burrow is going to take a $40 million per year deal or is going to take a $45 million per year deal, even though that's a ton of money, obviously. And any of us listening to this podcast, any of you listening to this podcast would probably take that deal. Joe Burrow is probably going to get a little bit more, but what can you do, Brad? Or what do you think is a reasonable expectation, knowing how the Bengals structure contracts and what little insight we have into this process from Burrow's perspective that might be quote unquote team friendly while still hitting that market setting value?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing he could do, or maybe him and his camp would be willing to do, would be to go to 5 years. Look, I'm sure they're trying to push for a 4-year deal. It's all super complicated with the representation for him and Herbert. It's a bunch of different people, but nevertheless, there are some people that also were involved with Daniel Jones, Dak Prescott. guys that have pushed back towards the 4-year extension, which was kind of the norm. And then, of course, once, like I just talked about Joe Mixon, once you have Patrick Mahomes sign a 10-year extension, every other team in the league can say, hey, Josh Allen, why would you not take at least 6 years? This guy took 10 and he's the greatest, quarterback maybe of all time, right? So you've then seen this pushback to the shorter deals, and I'm sure his camp wants to go as short as possible, especially because he's a little bit of an older guy, and get back to market as quickly as he possibly can. So I think the number one way he can help is say, all right, I'll take a 5-year extension, which would mean he's under contract for 7 more seasons. And would just give them a ton of flexibility, both from a cash flow standpoint and how they structure it, and of course, salary cap maneuvering as well. But yeah, I would be surprised if the average per year number is not the largest ever, at least at the time he signs it. I just would be surprised that's not the case.
Is there any reason or path realistically where you could see it like that percentage of the cap where he just gets a certain percentage year to year? I know that's been floated out there by some. Do you think that's realistic or no?
No, I'm not really sure why Florio, he loves bringing that one up.
Specifically him. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, look, it's a cool idea. It's a cool concept. I do believe there was a report that Russell Wilson's camp asked for it, I think the first time with Seattle. Of all the teams to like with him saying, I'd be most expected from Joe Burrow. Like, yeah, the Bengals are the team that are going to do that. Like, yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense. So short answer, no. Long answer, I get why he's kind of obsessed with the idea. But no, I don't think it happens this offseason.
So you're saying the Bengals are not going to give Joe Burrow a 5% stake in their organization as part of the extension?
Maybe they should work out an equity deal. I just don't know about tying the cash yearly to the salary cap. But yeah, the Paycor Joe Burrow Stadium has a nice ring to it.
That's right. Another thing that's a common point of discussion, going back to those Twitter arguments that you mentioned at the top of the show, is keeping Ja'Marr Chase, Tee Higgins, and Joe Burrow together. People will continue to, what do they say now? Like 50-50 ball to Tee Higgins merchant or something. That whole merchant thing as a derogatory thing. Anyway, the Bengals would like to keep.
You're on the internet too much. I don't even know what you're talking
Very
about.
online of you.
You try to keep up. We have to know. We have to know what the kids are saying. Anyway, they would like to keep the trio together. And there are a couple of examples of this in history. And I think the timing of these contracts, something that we've talked about, right? Ja'Marr Chase not up for a new deal for a couple of years here. Tee Higgins, obviously extension eligible now, but a lot of team control options in terms of the 5th-year option for Ja'Marr Chase and franchise tag options for both of those players available to the Bengals. Obviously, they prefer extensions, but it's realistic, right? To think that they can keep this group together. Obviously, it might be expensive. It might be a lot of money, but with the salary cap continuing to expand and the planning they've done on the defensive side of the ball that you talked about, would you say that seems to be their plan? That it's a realistic direction for them?
Certainly possible. It's certainly doable. And I'm sure in an ideal world, they find a way to get it done. I've just always kind of pushed back this offseason on the ease with which Bengals fans seem to think it can happen. Like, I don't think it's an easy thing to pull off. I think you're talking over $100 million a year for 3 players. I think a lot of the conversation has been like, yeah, they can make the cap work. The cap is borderline irrelevant in the conversation. It's simply, do they want to pay that much cash each season to 3 players on the roster? And do they think they can then spend to have a good defense? I mean, look, we'll get into it, but like Trey Henderson wants new money. DJ Reader needs new money, like yada, 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 yada. So I think they can pull it off. And I do think you hit a good point there where, look, Ja'Marr Chase is going to play 4 seasons, I think, before they have realistic extension conversations. Like even Justin Jefferson, I don't think he gets an extension done this offseason. I'm sure they try, but I kind of don't see it happening, which means you do have a decent window where I would actually be proactive with T and say, hey, take a 3-year extension just like everybody else last offseason, Deebo Samuel, DK Metcalf, etc. And by the time we're in the latter years of that deal, then Jamar's cash could kick in, and then it actually makes a ton of sense. But I kind of get the impression they're playing some hardball with T as well. And maybe they do think, like you said, the franchise tag is at their disposal there, and they're not afraid to use it.
If you're Tee Higgins' agent, David Mulligetta, what would you be looking for? Is 3 years enough? Would you want more? He's 24 years old. So if you did a 3-year extension, you'd hit the market well before 30 again. Is that the route you would go, or would you be looking for 4 years?
Yeah, no, I go short. All the guys pushing short last year was by design because they want to get back to the market when they're still young, right? I mean, the earlier you can get back at 27, I think teams are still going to give you top of market. When you look at DeAndre Hopkins and 29, 30 range is when some teams start to get a little bit scared. So yeah, I would point to those guys last offseason and try to do the exact same thing. And I'm sure that's also a battle. And the Bengals are saying, no, we want 4 years or we want 5 years. And basically at that point, it could be the only contract he ever signs, of significant value. So yeah, if I'm him, I'm saying I want 3 years, 75, whatever it is, maybe less than that, but and go from there. And I do think that's probably been a battle of a back and forth if I had to imagine.
Do you think 365 gets it done? Or is that too short?
Yeah, no, I think it's like right in the floor range, right? So it's just below 22 a year. Like I would say it's probably around the floor, or it would have to be extremely strong first 2 year cash flow, like 45 mil or 50 mil over 2. And then you're going into that last year with the understanding that you're probably going to extend him and he's not actually going to play that last year for 15 million in cash or whatever the case may be, which is kind of, how Cincinnati does things with their big signing bonuses. But I would guess that's like pretty close to the floor.
It will be interesting. And the way things are going, interesting as well. It makes all the sense in the world for these players to be getting short deals to get back to market. And the Bengals are a great example of a team that when you get to that 29, 30, it gets to be territory that they're not very comfortable or they're going to really stick to a number. And if they don't get the number they want, they're going to go younger. And that is going to be interesting on this defense where they've extended Jermaine Pratt. And so you ask any Bengals fan in February this year, which Bengals linebacker was likely to have more than 1 year left on their deal going into this season. It wasn't Jermaine Pratt. It was Logan Wilson, who I think many Bengals fans thought would be a priority for the Bengals to extend this year. Now the question is, this team that seems to understand positional value for the most part, if you look at their recent draft history and where they're making their investments, are they going to invest in 2 linebackers? Are they going to invest in an extension for an unfortunately aging, and I love DJ Reader, but the reality is that the NFL and the Bengals are going to see him as an aging nose tackle where the cliff for that position is not a cliff that you can see coming. It's a cliff in the fog, and eventually these players at those positions seem to hit that cliff. Chidobe Awuzie, a little bit older at corner, but still seems to be moving fantastically as he recovers from his ACL procedure. And Trey Hendrickson, he has 2 more years left on his deal. He's a free agent in 2020 after 2024. But how that works out in terms of increasing cash obligations on defense, very interesting. If you're looking at this externally, what do you think the most efficient way is for the Bengals to try to navigate what's going on their defense?
Yeah, and I had a thought I had to really quickly throw in there about the Tee Higgins thing too, is that tagging AJ Green was the right decision in the moment for AJ Green. But if you're these players now, you're saying like that threat is out there and I'm not going to have that happen to me. So anyway, back to defense.
Good call.
So, Reader's super tough, right? Because you're also in the middle of a market explosion right now that honestly rivals wide receiver last year. I mean, it's a bit underwhelming. I thought it'd be more, but nevertheless, like 10 dudes have been paid pretty massive deals at that position. If I'm them, I think the Dalvin Tomlinson deal is basically the easiest kind of benchmark I've ever seen. 4 years, 57, 14.25 per year. They're the same age. They're similar players. You want them at 1 tech. They can play some 3 tech and get a field a little bit here and there, but it's not exactly their bread and butter. Dalvin's been healthier, but I think Reader has made a bigger impact when he has played. Obviously has missed a little bit more time, but yeah, I think it's right in that range. It seems like they've been trying to find other answers there so they don't have to do this deal, but kind of haven't really been successful in that endeavor thus far. And look, the defense, they won a bunch of games when he was out, if I remember correctly, last year. But he also, when he came back, I think made like a noticeably tangible difference and things they did on early downs in particular. So I would try to get it done, but it is tough to where you're buying in a buyer's market, or you're buying in a player's market right now because everyone's getting paid at that position.
Real quick, I know you said, just going back to wide receiver, that you don't necessarily anticipate Justin Jefferson getting done this offseason. Is it safe to say that whatever that deal is just kind of sets the floor for Jamar Chase and what he's going to demand?
As long as he doesn't miss significant time, yes. And I think Jefferson probably will get. I know Tyreek Hill is listed at $30 million per year. He's on a 3-year, $75 million contract, at least in my opinion. I think Jefferson gets a legitimate. Maybe the deal starts with a 3, and it's an actual. He's that productive and that caliber. And then if Jamar has another 1,200 plus, impactful in every different way season. He's going to say, I'm a top 5 pick. I've been, better than this guy. We're on the same team and I was younger than him. All these things. Yeah, he would say, I'll take him plus 5%, would probably be the argument.
Do we need to start looking at some of these contracts with a lens toward inflation and kind of percentage of salary? I mean, seriously though, when we're looking at these huge deals, shouldn't we be comparing them to what the unadjusted cap is every year to say, how does Justin Jefferson's deal, which probably blows it away, compared to, say, a Randy Moss deal back in the day, or name a player who was a top paid player of their position when the salary cap was $100 million less?
Oh, yes. Go on overthecap.com, click on history. And if you go to contract history, you can look at every position and there's a tab you can sort by percent of the cap at signing. So exactly what we just talked about. So it's inflation adjusted APYs. Randy Moss is funny. Like Deion Sanders' numbers are hilarious. I want to say there's a couple where no one will ever surpass them because if you look at the salary cap in the year they signed and the percent they were taking up, it's just astronomical. Exactly, and that is how conversations are had. And we talked about the whole percent of cap thing for Joe Burrow. Like agents will say, hey, look, I want my guy to get 25. And they'll say, we think he's worse than this guy who's getting 25. And you'll say, yeah, but that guy signed for 25 2 years ago. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is a thing that exists in the contract negotiation ecosystem.
Well, Brad, we appreciate the time today. You can find him at PFF_Brad on Twitter. You can find his work over at PFF.com. Does great work in terms of projecting free agency deals every year. It's always shocking how close you get on some of those contracts, and he's always a great resource for cap-related questions and did great work on the offseason grades as well. So we appreciate your time, Brad. Thanks for the insights today. And, well, if you're at the end of this episode still with us, make sure you're here for our next episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast, hoping to have a nice surprise guest for you here in the offseason coming soon, or it might be a mailbag, and maybe the guest will be next week. So keep your eyes out for what we're doing next here on Locked On Bengals. And until next time, hoo-day, and have a good one.